All right, as we were just talking about, we are seeing violence in the Middle East as tensions between Israel and Palestinians reached a boiling point the last couple days. Just before we went on air, there have been reports that Israeli troops have actually entered the Gaza Strip. Just today, the U.S., which has always been a close ally of Israel, actually objected to a request for a meeting of the UN Security Council to discuss the situation there. Dramatic images captured from the moment missiles from an Israeli airstrike destroyed a 14-story building in Gaza. Israeli troops entered the Gaza Strip. More than 90 people, including more than a dozen children, have now died in the violence. To discuss, let's bring in Tennessee Congressman David Kustoff, who's one of only 2 Jewish Republican House members. Congressman, thanks for being back with us.
Thank you, Sean, for having me.
You know, it's amazing. We were talking about this before we went on air. A few months ago, we were talking about how many more countries were going to be added or join the Abraham Accords and continue this evolution towards peace. And now the scope of Hamas bombings on Israeli civilians is unprecedented. It seems like times have changed real quick because of the shift in administrations.
You know, Sean, I think that's an excellent point. And I've got to tell you, I thought about the exact same thing earlier this week when the attack started, when the rockets from Hamas started. I remember being in the south lawn of the White House where you worked for the signing of those agreements back in September, just several months ago, under the Trump administration. And, you know, leadership really does matter because the one thing about President Trump is everybody knew where he stood as related to Israel. You know, as far as American presidents go in their support of Israel, I don't know if Donald Trump is number one, but if he's not, he's certainly at the top of a very short list of presidents who've lent their support and credibility. And frankly, the force of his personality, I know, contributed to the signing of those very agreements. And the fact of the matter is, now with the change in leadership with President Biden, the Middle East doesn't see that same commitment, I think, unfortunately, coming from United States leadership, from our executive leadership. And it sends maybe a subliminal signal that what Hamas is doing will be tolerated. And obviously that's unfortunate.
Yeah. You know, Congressman, even in our own country, in Chicago, disturbing images of protesters tearing Israeli flags in support of Hamas. You know, what do you make of this type of action and this sort of rhetoric?
Well, unfortunately, you know, people pay attention, especially around the world, to what leaders in Washington say, what they don't say, and how they say it. And the fact of the matter is, from the White House, the rest of the world, and certainly the Middle East, I don't think they see the same level of commitment to Israel that they did under President Trump. You know, everybody knew exactly where Donald Trump stood on every single issue, including the sanctity and the security of Israel, and the importance of Israel is really the only diplomacy in the Middle East. They don't see that from the Biden White House. So I strongly encourage President Biden to talk loudly, talk strongly in support of Israel. Let the rest of the world know that the United States has the back of its true friend in the Middle East, Israel.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. He has made it clear that Israel has the right to defend itself. Thanks. That's great. I appreciate those. I'm sure Israel is warmed by those comments. But your colleague on the other side, AOC, reacted to the president's comments on the conflict by saying this: blanket statements like these with little context or acknowledgement of what precipitated this cycle of violence, namely the expulsion of Palestinians and attacks on Al-Aqsa, dehumanize Palestinians and imply the U.S. will look the other way at human rights violation. It's wrong. Hello? The idea that a country can't defend itself? How is that controversial? And yet this is a member of Congress.
Well, 2 points. Again, the rest of the world does pay attention to what is said in Washington and what's not said in Washington. And certainly, being a member of Congress, she's a leader. And so people do pay attention, and other parts of the world, and that's why it's important for President Biden. It's why it's important for me to come out and speak strongly in support of our ally. And I think about one thing that Netanyahu has said. I'll paraphrase him, probably not very well, but Benjamin Netanyahu said, if Arabs were to lay down their arms, there would be no violence. If Israel laid down their arms, there would be no Israel. And I think that pretty much says it all. That sends the signal, and we should follow up on that. We've got to make sure that the rest of the world knows that the United States is going to stand behind its ally. If not, it's at risk. And look, I visited Israel. I know other leaders have visited Israel. Very small territory, very small landmass, surrounded by enemies on all sides.
I only have about 30 seconds here, but do want to get your response to this. You had mayoral candidate Andrew Yang. He had posted a pro-Israel tweet, then later deleted it. You know, it seems like a lot of Democrats are almost embarrassed of their support of Israel. What do you make of that, this movement to almost be a bit ashamed of our support?
Lindsay, that's an interesting question, because I've noticed over the last several years, this was bipartisan to make sure that Israel was supported and that we had their back. And with the election of some of the progressives of the last several years, I know that there are Democrat members and moderates who want to be strong for Israel, but it's almost like they're shamed. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's almost like they're shamed. And the point that you just made about Andrew Yang, that he has to walk back, essentially, his support of Israel, I think demonstrates it and says it all.
Yes.
Those Democratic leaders, they need to step up, and they need to, if they will, silence that progressive wing of their party to show the support of Israel.
I couldn't agree with you more. Congressman, thanks for sharing this with us. Appreciate it as always.
Thank you for having me on.